Bienvenue à tous.
Welcome everyone in this new session entitled Facing the New Deal of Globalization, which has been prepared by Mario Pedzini, the director of OECD and who stands for Le Cercle des Économistes. He's by me. Hello. With such a title, we think that this new emerging world and this emergence of great powers such as China and India, this new power relationship between East and West is the new context for what we might call a bad deal of globalization, because a misdeal of globalization. Because we saw that with the pandemic, something is not working about cooperation. If vaccines were conceived and manufactured in other countries, they're still held by those. For developing countries or the poorest countries, there are misleading notions. There is no balance between wealth. So this morning we we'll see the analysis of people. Online, we have Ibrahim Mayaki, General Secretary of NEPAD, that is a planning and coordination agency for development in Africa. He's in South Africa right now, and we can see here on screen Sachin Chaturvedi, who's in New Delhi. And he's a researcher, and he's Director General of a think tank for research and information. We also have Justin Yulin, who's a teacher and researcher in Beijing. Hello. And we have here Pierre Jacquet, who was chief economist of French Development Agency, and who's very committed to NGOs. And we also have Chelek Kanté, the State Minister of Senegal. Hello to everyone. And before listening to you, I'll hand the floor to Mario Pedzini, who has 3 minutes to present the conceptual framework of the session. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. There's a joke of Albert Tishman. Two people meet in the street and one tells the other, well, we haven't seen each other for a long time. You were small and now you're tall. You were blonde and now you have brown hair. And the guy says, but my name is not Paul. And the other says, oh, you changed so much, you changed even your name. Well, I think that this is quite significant of economists because sometimes they do want to acknowledge change, and this is what we're talking about. And this follows suit to another debate with a similar theme. And all speakers agreed that the system was not appropriate today to face the many challenges we have to address, such as the health challenge. Facing the major crisis we had, which was more serious than world wars, well, what kind of official helps we had for development? An increase of 3%. And this is very low at a global level. So we need to intervene. But there is a problem of demand because the states have a problem with jurisdiction on a national level, and they keep fighting on a Westphalian logic, which is a national one. But there's also a problem of supply, because players' objectives and modalities changed. 70 years ago, the cooperation was meant by the wealthiest countries. And the Committee for Assistance to Development at the OECD does not gather all the members of OECD, whereas the world, so China, India, South Africa, Brazil, as other actors for the cooperation. This is what Dominique said. So we have roundtables, but they are too small and not representative because the world changed so much that between 2000 and 2010, some countries, there were 83 countries whose growth was twice as fast as countries from the western part of the world. In the past, we wanted to address extreme poverty, and we thought, well, we give money to developing countries, and when they reach the extreme poverty threshold, there will be a generation of wealth, and it will be fine. But in fact, this is not what happened, because there are problems concerning institutions, productivity. So financial help cannot be the only answer in such a context. Now, the objectives has changed so much that we're talking about SDGs. And it's not only about GMP and extreme poverty. And then modalities, if you look at international cooperation, what do you hear about? You hear about triangular cooperation or South-South cooperation. And we think, well, maybe it's a marginal initiative, but it is a radical change, in fact. It is not only about monetary exchange. It is about talking about policies. How should we do them? How efficient are they in different fields? And that's what we did with the OECD in the past, but those were only wealthy countries. And now the demand comes from developing countries. So we have to change the players, the objectives, and the modalities. What could we do? Well, if we need to change the international multilateral system, well, you know, when it occurred, it was because of World War, and it was really costly. So there might be several propositions. Pascal Lamy talks about polylateralism, if I'm not mistaken. We talk about multilateral experimentalism. So if we find subjects or themes where we can create a coalition of different players, not only public players and different countries, let's work on it and see what comes out. And we can monitor the facts and learn, and there are multiplying effects. And this is the idea. And here we will have contributions of and some examples of this. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you, Mario Pedzini. And right now we'll see what's possible in a very concrete case of cooperation with IFM that wanted to favor the crisis recovery, and African countries have specific demands concerning the way it's possible to manage the money. So I'll hand the floor to Cheikh Kanté, the State Minister for Senegal. You have 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Okay, it's working. Thank you, Dominique. First, if I may, I would like to be fair and tell you about Jean-Hervé Lorenzi, who has the expertise, magic expertise, to organize those meetings every year. And we come, despite the rain, to talk about very important things that address our lives and our futures. And Africa was always present, because the Dakar consensus we are talking about was born here in Aix-en-Provence with Jean-Hervé Lorenzi and Mrs. Christine Lagarde. And I thank them very warmly, because she came to Africa and she met with 6 heads of states to discuss about growth, governance, global governance. And it is thanks to Jean-Hervé Lorézy and Christine Lagarde. So I'm paying tribute to them. And I also wish to thank Professor de Boissieu, who for decades valued the African human capital. He trained students who became ministers, teachers, presidents, and I wanted to underline that. And then the director of the Development Center, Mario, who works at the Development Center of the OECD, but also development for African countries. And he worked on several functional development plans, such as Senegal. I'm sorry, but you have only 3 minutes left. So the idea of those DTS came from his laboratory in 2016 to use DTS as a financing source for growth of African country. And our last forum, International and Economy for Africa, organized in Dakar. And in the resolution, we talked about the necessity to have new SDRs to finance an inclusive growth of African countries. And SDR have a fundamental role. They are financial instruments that was created by the IMF with 5 currencies: dollars, euros, yen, the pound, and the yuan in China. And the goal is to support some countries and allow them to stabilize their currency or to convert their currency into strong money. Now, the advantage of those SDRs is that the rate is quite low, 0.5%. So it helps African countries financing their needs for inclusive development, because the rates are otherwise 10, 12, or 6%. And those SDRs should not be a cake to share, in our opinion. They should be allow us to implement a new mechanism to increase the part of Africa on a global scale. And we are trying to achieve stabilization. We would like to also to buy back the African debt in that would be quantitative easing. And it would make Africa a connected financial market so as to attract investors, so that Africa could have access to capital with reduced costs. So I think this is how we should use the SDRs, so that Africa, in a post-COVID logics, to have a specific place in the global governance. Thank you, Shelley Kanté. So you talked about how we should use those SDRs so as to reform Africa's governance and you have sovereignty for funds. And governance is a subject that Ibrahim Mayaki would like to address. He's online with us from South Africa. You are the Secretary General of NEPAD, that is in favor of African development. Now, Ibrahim, what are the scenarios in Africa's towards globalization? What are the main trends? Can you hear me? Yeah, very well. Right. So thank you for inviting me, and I agree completely with what Shelley Kante said in terms of thanking people. First point, there are two phenomena that we noticed on the continent since the beginning of the pandemic. First, an acceleration of regional integration phenomenon. Even though at one point some borders closed and our moves were limited, but concerning the health answer and the economic answer, there was an accelerated movement towards local integration. So politically, and through the decisions that were made, there was a will to go towards more regional integration concerning infrastructures, implementation of corridors, implementation of CDCs. Over 30 countries, the coordinations and of African Union evidences this movement. A second movement is a questioning of the capability of states to face such a crisis. And what I mean when I speak of questioning the capacity, the way we discuss transport educations or so forth was eased by quantitative objectives or quantified results, but transparency of communication was much easier because it wasn't appraised by civil society, companies, etc. Now, with the pandemic, we have a very clear vision of what is done and what is not done. So the capability of the state stands bare somehow. And because it is so clear, and we have a divided political landscape, well, necessarily there will be greater participation of civil society because those players have freed themselves during that period. So a greater international integration of regions and a move towards states' capacity are movements towards more freedom. And it will bring new types of governance that we cannot anticipate right now, because those types of governance will come essentially from the bottom. So it's not top to bottom now, it's going to be bottom to the top functioning. And in both cases, if we wish, if we think about integration, regional integration, and we want to accelerate the move, it will be absolutely necessary to rely upon very small, micro or small companies. If we want to transform the state, then it won't be about experts, but we will be influenced by civil society so as to reform the state. And this will lead to a situation where Africa will need to reinvent itself. And in doing so, Africa will have a different view of globalization. Globalization evidenced its best and worst aspect during this very peculiar crisis. And between those two, we need to find a balance. And we have to focus on regional integration and freedom of players that came out during the period, so that there might be a reform of the state. And I think this is key for the future, because, and you have to be aware that in the background, there is a population whose median age is 19 and who needs results in the short term. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So there were forms of regional cooperation which did function in Africa at the time of the crisis. There was also kind of a state check-in. You know, we were able to ascertain what the state could do and not do. And what changed was also to modify cooperation. Now we need to take into consideration bottom to top and not top to bottom. Africa needs to reinvent itself. And you have to insist on the role that private companies may play. And this is a perfect transfer to give the floor to Sachin Chaturvedi, who is with us from India, from New Delhi. And Mr. Chaturvedi, you'll talk about the new forms of North-South and South-South cooperation within the field of new technologies. And you will focus on Fintechs. Sachin Chaturvedi, I hope can you hear us? Can you see us? So, Ella, good morning. Well, you know, you probably heard the talk about the African continent, and now, sir, you work in Beijing, and you'd like to insist on the role of the industrialization, which is mandatory to create jobs, fight against poverty. What are the conditions necessary for this to take place in developing countries, emerging countries, and why you are suggesting the role of free zones? 5 minutes, sir.
Well, it's a great honor for me to participate in this high-level forum. And since time is short, I'll come into my points directly. I'd like to highlight the importance to use spatial economic zone as a jumping pad for industrialization in the global south, including Africa, South Asia, Central Asia, Latin America, to realize the industrialization and a way to achieve the SDGs. The world is committed to realize the 17 goals of sustainable development by the time of 2030s. All those goals certainly are desirable. Goal 1, eradication of extreme poverty. Goal 2, zero hunger. Goal 3, good health, and so on. They are desirable, but for people to realize those goals, they need to have income. If they have income, then they're not poor. If they have good income, they will buy food for themselves, so they can avoid hunger. If they have adequate income, certainly they will take care of their own health. But to have income, you need to have jobs. That's goal 8 of SDG. But currently, if you go to a low-income country, no matter how poor, people offer a job. Either in agriculture, traditional agriculture, or informal sectors. They all have jobs, but they cannot generate adequate income. And to have adequate income, historically, we know you need to have better technology for agriculture and so on. But more importantly, you also need to have industrialization. If a country specializes on agriculture, they must be poor. They need to have industrialization. And the importance of industrialization has been recognized by all countries since they gained political independence after the Second World War. But most industrialization failed. I think for two reasons. The first one, they are too ambitious in their industrialization. They adopted so-called the import substitution strategies, try to build up large-scale advanced industries, but they are poor capital scarce economy. They did not have competitive advantages in those kind of industries. So for industrialization to be successful, the first principle, they need to follow their competitive advantages. We know most low-income countries or developing countries, they equipped with abundant labor force, especially young labor force. And they have competitive advantages in labor-intensive industries. If they follow the labor-intensive industry-oriented development strategy that's along their competitive advantages, then they can generate a large number of jobs and with decent income. But secondly, they also need to have adequate infrastructure, because if you want to have industrialization, you need to have power, electricity, road network, port facility, and so on. But currently, most developing countries, they don't have good infrastructure. You also need to have a good business environment. But again, if you go to developing countries, many of them, business environment is not desirable. But if the developing country can follow their competitive advantages to jumpstart their industrialization, there's good opportunity now. Because historically, a few successful developing countries to reach high income status, they all follow some kind of flying geese pattern. Some countries, they industrialize.
Justinine, je vous remercie. Je vais vous demander de conclure en 30 secondes.
Sir, could you give us a conclusion in 30 seconds? Because sorry, you're going beyond the time. So could you give us a conclusion in 2 minutes?
Okay, 2 minutes. And I just like, Japan became high income, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore enters. In the 1980s, those East Asian economy become newly industrialized, high income economies, China enters. And now China is about to be high income country by the time of 2025. And China will release 85 million jobs in light manufacturing for other lower income country enter. And that will be sufficient for African country to have industrialization, South Asian country, Central Asian country to have industrialization. But also need to have good infrastructure. But because of most country infrastructure are poor, if you have sufficient resources, certainly you can improve infrastructure, business environment for the whole nation. But you need to be pragmatic. The pragmatic way is to build enclave or spatial economic zones. Within a zone, you have adequate infrastructure business environment. Then you can jumpstart the industrialization, and then you can have a virtuous cycle and become a very dynamic, growing country. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Merci. Thank you. We'll remember the importance of industry to create jobs, to pull out of the informal sector and to achieve growth. And it's a real challenge for African countries which still don't have infrastructures. I don't know if Sachin Chaturvedi is in line. Yes, Sachin Chaturvedi, hello, in New Delhi. Hello, sir. Now, you will talk to us about the new forms of cooperation, North-South and South-South cooperation, in a very specific field, very concrete, the domain of new technologies, and you'll focus on Fintech. Dr. Chaturvedi, you have the floor. 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Dominic. I must congratulate the organizers for this opportunity, and must also thank my friend Mario for bringing all of us together. I think the panel has brought out some very important points in terms of how there is this unprecedented opportunity that we have before us to rethink, to reimagine, and reinitiate the process for international cooperation. The COVID-19 crisis has posed a huge challenge and crisis, both in terms of how institutions go forward and how we collectively respond to the broad challenges we have. And from that perspective, it's good that Mario reminded us of multilateral experimentalism vis-a-vis what Pascal has been talking about in terms of polylateralism. I think the challenge here is of the impasse we see in state multilateralism. And that's where we need to see how we coming together responds to the larger challenge of localization of development. My friend here, Mayaki, has talked about SDGs. I think Agenda 2030 is important for this localization of development. And that's the reason why I thought of picking up technologies that are of great significance. And I have chosen to speak on Fintech today, because we are seeing that the transformation of financial services is going to go forward in terms of responding to whatever is left now of our traditional multilateral lenders, the World Bank and IMF, with the rise of the new development bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We need to see how the technology can bring into people what our traditional systems have found hugely constrained. And I think we need to reimagine the role of global multilateral institutions. And that's why I see technology as a solution when we see the emerging market developing economies that are getting the basic payment services together, trying to bring in financial integration that could support a greater diversification, and are also trying to see how they are going to respond to several challenges. And one of the challenges that I feel now, which is very much prominent before us, is the cross-border regulatory arbitrage that they face. And this is where the new globalization, the new trust of global institutions would be of great significance. Fintech would have to bring in innovations that is to overcome the market failure that we are seeing with the new liberal trade order that we are witnessing multilateral institutions imbibing in. And that change would be important as we see with COVID-19 crisis. There is a huge expansion in digital transactions across the South. And that's where South-South cooperation comes in extremely center to the idea of triangular partnerships. India and ASEAN have partnered. We are also witnessing India-UK partnership. I think the EU approach would have to be revisited. I was expecting it to be taken up by the Italian G20 presidency. But unfortunately, we have still to wait, though France has pushed in a major initiative at the recently held G7, which was more about the vaccine and the TRIPS waiver. But I think on the technology front, there are certain areas when it comes to fintech which are of importance. On the vaccine, I would come in a minute. But on the global issues on fintech, the issues related to standards for digital trade, the data protection regimes, the digital taxation, and small and medium enterprise financing are some of the issues which are so narrow but have such wider impact all across Africa and all across Asia and Latin America, where small and medium enterprises are to be the new vehicles for globalization. And that's why I tried to connect it with localization of development. As I see my last minute, I need to bring in the very important platform that India has come up with. Is called CoWIN, which is a vaccination platform.
Là, vous avez dépassé votre temps. Il vous reste 30.
I'm sorry, sir, but you got 30 seconds left in your speech. 30. You got 30 seconds left. Please, could you conclude? Thank you very much.
So that's where the CoWIN has a role to play with Nigeria, Uganda, UAE, and Panama, which have partnered, and this, I think, is going to take the role of technology forward. And in the new globalization, we need to see how ethics, particularly access, equity, inclusion of technology is to be addressed when we have the new globalization before us. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, sir, from New Delhi. You did insist on a key point. It's not just issues of governance and will, but there are also technologies which change the way we do things and which can somewhat revisit cooperation between institutions. I'm turning to Pierre Jacquet, who is with us, a member of the Cercle des Économistes, and who will intervene on the way public support to development failed partly, and how did it partly fulfill its mission? Pierre Jacquet, you got 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. Prior to answering your question, I'd like to step back and insist on the fact that we often there is a confusion between globalization and the governance of globalization. Globalization is in progress. It is structurally with us for years to come, and we see its impact through the technical interdependence, with the NTCI, in terms of healthcare. Virus don't know borders, and the fight against viruses do not know borders. We know today that the restoration of healthcare in any country will depend on what's going to happen in Africa and in other countries of the world. So clearly, there is a globalization in the strong meaning of the word. In economic terms, because we are in Aix-en-Provence, in terms of what we call global common goods, including healthcare, but climate, global warming, the loss of the biodiversity, all these topics no longer belong to specific companies, societies, groups, or countries, or even regions. These are global subjects. Yet, globalization is here, and in a way, it will continue, regardless of what we do. But it will manage itself. But if we let things go by themselves, it's going to be difficult. So we need a governance system. We had one framework set up after the Second World War, and we can strongly believe, it was said around this table, that this framework is not suitable. It is unsuitable because it's based on a system of principles, rules, and good practices which were implemented after the Second World War, which founded the development experience of northern countries, and which led to a proselytism of northern countries towards southern countries. One of the reasons why the development support is unsuitable, it's not because it doesn't have results. It has very good human results. Maybe it doesn't have macroeconomic results we hoped for, but growth meet other factors, not just getting money from outside. But one of the problem of support, it is founded on the proselytism of good practice. So, the development becomes a technocratic vision, and it is replaced by a set of good practices that developed countries have not always followed, but which is still we're still trying to impose to developing countries. I think it's a mistake, because development is not that. It's far more complex. It is social and political and local. And therefore, one of the questions that support was not able to manage properly is how to help Africa reinvent itself. Well, we try to explain to Africa how to reinvent itself. So this movement failed. So we have to change things, and change the perspectives, and look at what we identified, without, like the ownership, the appropriation by developing countries of their fate. The other fundamental reason for which this framework is unsuited, it's based on a system of value based on market economy, which today is insufficient and unsuitable, not because it wasn't used, not because the market economy failed, but simply there are values which appear today in societies which are not taken into account by the market, the environment, climate, biodiversity, inequalities, and so on and so forth. So we can see that we reach the limit of these value systems where the operation of the market, on which the market system is anchored, and we need a new value system. It's costly, it is difficult, and it relies on mechanisms within our own societies while having a global dimension. So therefore, the management of globalization starts here, and it makes it more difficult because the reform process should take place, but in addition, it had to be coordinated at the global level. So how can we do it? Well, first, the return of politics, the end of technocratization in a way. Because to create a value system, it's highly political at the noble sense of the word, in the noble meaning of the word, high politics versus small politics. And eventually, what is at stake here for the restoring globalization after Second World War was a large political negotiation. Once that was done, we stopped cooperating at the level of high politics because there was a set of rules. When you apply rules, you don't need to cooperate. Today, we need to reinvent this cooperation at the global level. We have to be modest. We have to widen the cooperation table, as Mario said. A large number of countries should be represented. And of course, possibly, we should develop what Europe developed, which is the mutual recognition. Accept that value system of other countries are not always matching ours. And this is a very difficult political process, which calls for modesty, attention, and acceptation of what others do. And I think this is where the problem lies today. I'll close with on your question to help to support development. No, yes. Of course, support is insufficient. It has to continue. We have to learn, improve. And today, it seems that what is at stake, the key problem, is to support developing countries to gain the ability to make their own decisions. And this is something that we have not been able to help them to do. Thank you, Pierre-Jacques. Thank you all for these presentations, very rich presentations. I don't know if we have questions from the public, but I have a question that came on the, well, you talk about informal, that to turn into industries, new ways to look at things, bottom up, and from bottom to top. So, and now these remittances sent by the diasporas, and which actually contribute to the growth of the countries, and which somewhat shapes the development of countries without governmental intervention. Now, is this something that is taken into account today by the leaders of developing countries, Chef Santé? Of course, the remittances from diaspora is huge. It's a huge volume, which has actually an impact on the social stability of developing countries. But before addressing this in its substance, I'd like to talk about some concerns which have been mentioned there by all the speakers, and which brings me to the conclusion of the book of Jean-Hervé Lorenzi, Rupture and Reconciliation, Rupture versus Global Governance. We all observed here the limits of globalization of capitalism and its excesses or failings. So we have to change the paradigm. very much like Africa doesn't need help. Africa needs partners, solid partnership. We're no longer in 1960 when René Dumont said Africa is on a bad track. Well, Africa is on a good track. We are in Afro-optimism because African leaders know what they want to do. The young African generation knows what it wants. African women know what they want. Yeah, we need a recomposition of data, restructuring of data. Often the policies we applied were dictated from outside. I talked earlier on about the 10 commandments of the Washington 10 Commandments, this Washington consensus. On the table we put, and I reminded it here, we've put a soft revolution started in Aix-en-Provence with Mrs. Christine Lagarde, Christian de Boissieu, Jean-Henri Lorenzi, the Dakar Consensus and the 7 Paradigms. So Christian Georges came to Dakar to meet with 6 head of states, African head of states, around the table. We talked, and his conclusion was that it announced the solution that we recommend today for the post-COVID crisis. Reconciliation vis-à-vis history, the problems of debt that African countries face today. Well, Europe went through it as well. America went through it too. In 1814, King Louis XVIII restored trust of the lenders by having in Article 70 of the Constitutional Charter that public debt had to be paid. Guillaume of Orange in 1694 created the Bank of England, which had to refinance the British economy, which was in high debt. In 1816, the debt of England was 250% of the GDP. Thank you for this reminding of history. But in 1946, the debt of England was 300%. Because thanks to the bank that the UK was able to restore its balance, Europe was able to achieve a consensus worth 750 billion euros. And we created the Federal Reserve in the US, and this contamination brought the same model with the Wagner report in 1960. So, if we look at the history, we realize that clearly there are instruments which were used and which are still used to solve specific economic problems. Africans themselves should be able to deal with their development issues. This is why I am in the opinion, like many experts, that it is specific. This should not be a cake to be shared, but a new system or a new mechanism that could make it possible for Africa to count in global governance post-COVID. Sheikh Kate, when we talk about the new aspect of global cooperation, it is because Africa is emerging. There is some certain optimism. It interests more and more powers, medium or large. What happens too is that African countries may have a wider offering for cooperation. That is, they can do cooperation with China, India, Turkey, Germany. So if it is still online with us, I'd like to ask the question to Ibrahim Mayaki. Is this also what changed the aspect of cooperation, the advent of the new players who themselves were developing countries? Maybe they have different solutions to propose, and African countries want to adopt. Yes, it is true that the scope of partnership has increased and many entrepreneurs are specialized. But the difference, however, with Europe is that Europe is close to Africa, is a neighbor, and Africa is close to Europe. Yeah. And since we're neighbors, the type of partnership we have to build must be seen to adapt itself to mutual interest. So the quality and the content of cooperation with Europe is not the same that the one we have with other partners because of this close-by relation. Thank you. Mario Pedzini, would you like to make a comment? And then we'll get back to our guests in India and China. First, I'm very happy to have listened to these considerations. We've seen two proposals, very precise proposal, the utilization of the special lending rate. And he says, well, you know, there is a need for infrastructure. We need to build infrastructures for industrialization. Therefore, I propose that countries like China should support for the creation of free zones, free trade zones are free. We know, we have the experience. We know this also. You know, if you build a road, you know, and in a zone, then as we know, it will spread, and we can discuss the efficacy of the measures and the exhaustivity. But we can see clearly a project. We can see the advent of clear project. Now, I'd like to make a second comment. That is the political game, and indeed, what us as Europeans, where do we stand? I'm a bit worried there because first our commission is more geopolitical. We talked about the Europe's strategic autonomy, but if we want this autonomic strategy, we should close. We accept the idea that we have joint value, and the others have to accept the value before we have a dialogue. So, which are the dialogues which are inside Europe? Poland and Denmark, not sure. In the OECD, we don't know, we're not certain what are the values between Sweden and Turkey. So the notion of value can be dangerous and could actually separate more than create partnerships. So I will raise a note of attention. And if we have to need cooperation with Africa, Latin America, Mario Pedzini, this will be the closing words. Thank you for this conclusion and this warning that we were together with Ibrahim Mayaki, Sachi Zaturvedi, Justin Lynch, Pierre Jacquet, and Sheikh Kantese on this stage. Thank you all.